I'm here to give you a quick introduction into the sort of more recent impacts of climate change that we're having to cope with in our woodlands, highlight a few of the impacts of that, and potentially also make some suggestions for ways to get around this or actually make the situation a little bit better. So we're all familiar that in Nottinghamshire we've got a tremendous amount of different woodland types. So we've got farm woodland, we've got royal forests that date back to long before 1600. We've got the dukeries, which design landscapes for the benefit of the people living there at the time. We've got energy forests of eucalyptus in the county. And we've also got conifer plantations, and I suppose in a way they're heritage as well, because they're related to the mining industry and everything that was there. And there's thousands of trees being planted across the county, bringing multiple benefits to lots of different people. But how resilient are those trees that we're planting? With the broadleaf tree species that we're planting, 5 of the species make up 77% of all broadleaf trees in woodlands in England. And you'll see, as you would know, that there'll be ash, oak, beech, sycamore and birch making up percentage. And all of these have challenges, some more challenging than the other. That might be acute oak decline on oak, you've guessed it, ash dieback on ash, of course, and then we've got other things, grey squirrels, drought issues, the number of deer that have an impact on them. When we look at the conifer species, 6 conifer species make up 89% of all coniferous trees. So Scots pine, Corsican pine, we've got problems there with red band needle blight, particularly in the Sherwood area. Sitka spruce, not really one for our part of the country, but it too has its problems. And then larches, Douglas fir, Norway spruce, and we've got great spruce bark beetle on Norway spruce, and Phytophthora on larches. So there's always something that's going on with the trees, and it will impact in varying degrees in different parts of the country, really. So the figures up there will be fairly familiar to you. The Forestry Commission have probably been standing in front of boards for the past 10 years saying similar things, as well as a lot of other people. But 2024 was the first time the world's average temperatures increased by 1.5 degrees, which was kind of a threshold. It was the 4th warmest year on record. Spring was the warmest on record, and in 2024 we had 7% more rainfall than average. It was 17th wettest year since records began in 1800s. 2 red warnings for wind, and some real wind problems with trees being blown over in certain parts of the country. A bit in Nottinghamshire, a few, but generally odd trees rather than other things. Droughts and flooding, and this is, for me, I think, becoming one of the big problems with trying to establish woodland, is that we're dealing with sites which certain times of the year are flooded, and then at other times of the year are a drought, completely suffering with drought, and you get problems like this. Is a woodlands over near Newark, was planted, and then half of the field there is underwater for several months. Now they've got the species right at that end, and they've tailored it to willows and things on the wet area, more open ground. But then you've got the droughts as well, so the trees are selecting trees maybe for drought conditions, and then potentially a few months later, for flood conditions, potentially a few months later, then dealing with drought. This is a picture here of a Maya spruce tree, and this was planted in a woodland that I planted on our family's farm, but what it was actually looked at was potentially establishing certain trees on the site first that were more robust and make it a more favourable condition later on by removing some of those trees, in this instance for Christmas trees, and then having more sensitive trees growing between them. But the drought's been really widespread throughout the country. The picture There is an ancient semi-natural oak woodland in the southwest, and on a south-facing slope where it's been particularly hit by the sun, there's trees dying there. And it's not just trees that are being coppiced or pollarded, it's trees that are mature specimens. And you can see from the amount of epicormic growth on there that that tree is stressed and not happy. And it may take many years to show what the impacts of these droughts are on trees. Just because they survive one year doesn't mean to say that they're going to be healthy the next. And then we see, of course, planting, new planting. This was from droughts in 2018 and in 2022, where for the grant-aided woodland that the Forestry Commission funded, we released additional one-off payments to actually replace some of the trees because the losses were, in some instances, in the region of 70%. And that's not just beating up, that's more or less having to start from scratch. So, and as I say, the younger trees are very susceptible to these. There's some work being done in Germany on mixed stands of trees, highlighting that diffuse porous species such as lime and sycamore are more sensitive to drought than diffuse porous tree species, and this is all to do with the timber makeup. And it may be that peduncular oak, ash, hickory, elm, sweet chestnut are more resilient in a mixture, but really we're kind of in the early phases of working that kind of information out on mixtures. And then we'll look at wind throw and wildfire risk. As I say, not too much wind flow in our part of the country. I was in North Yorkshire last year, a lot of wind throw, a lot of landscape belts and areas of woodland, both broadleaf and coniferous, blown over. That's one tree in Stapleford Woods, so I think maybe Stapleford Woods could maybe manage without that one tree, but no doubt be more there. Wildfire is becoming more of a risk, and we're currently throughout England on an amber warning for wildfire risk because it's just so dry out there. I believe there's been one big fire down in Dorset, and we will see more of those. And the figure in Nottinghamshire had lost 17 hectares of tree cover between 2001 and 2023 from fires, with 7 hectares in 2014 alone. So I know when I worked at Sherwood Pines, fire watching was a big part of the job. And beyond that, we've got all the other bugs and beasties as well. So we've got the sweet chestnut blight at the end there, located in a few areas. Oak processionary moth, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Acute oak decline over there. Fairly widespread throughout the area, and I believe there's presentations on that later. And ever increasing numbers of deer. I've been involved in deer work with the Forestry Commission since 1990, and I've never known as many deer in Nottinghamshire as there is at the moment, and the widespread nature of them and the spread of species. And all of these, with climate change will support population increases, whether it's more food for deer to grow, more cover in wind throw, whether it's wetter conditions at certain times of the year and fungi becoming more of an issue. So there are all these bits and pieces that we've got to watch out for. This is a slide I've just added on oak processionary moth. So, and it was a couple of trees, I believe, that were found that were potentially landscaping oak trees in Long Eaton, so not a million miles away from here. And this is the ongoing sort of monitoring and control of those trees. And if anyone's got any information about that, there is a link, email address there for Teresa that can be contacted about. But it's important that oak processionary moth has a real sort of public health issue, so it's important that you don't touch or go near the nests or the caterpillars, don't let children near them, and don't try and remove the nests themselves. So if you have a look on the Forest Research website, there's a lot of information there to show you what it looks like. Other climate-related changes, we're seeing changes in the time of trees coming into leaf. trees producing fruit, flowers, all that kind of stuff, all around phenology, frost risk patterns as well. So that means if you're planting bare-rooted trees, it's sometimes getting difficult to get the trees hardened off to actually start doing planting. And then once you've planted the trees, you could get frosts at different times of the year. And carbon dioxide increase, and the work that's being carried on in a Bifor experiment in Birmingham is looking at carbon increase and potentially a 10% increase of growth of the trees, but also a continuation of storing carbon and storing carbon for longer. So potentially a plus side to that, but then also you've got to realise that the CO2 increases will benefit all other ground flora, so you may have changes in ground flora in woodland where you've got more competitive grass species, maybe more competitive against other trees. So with all these things, how do we go about making a decision about what tree we could potentially plant? First thing we've got that's been created within the Forestry Commission and Forest Research is a decision support tool called ecological site classification. There's around 60 different tree species on there. You put in the grid reference of where you are. You also need to put in some details about what the soils are, because soils are crucial for all forestry and all tree growing. That's the first thing you've got to understand is your soils. And it will come up with a list of species that could be suitable going forward to 2080. So dark green, very suitable, green, suitable, yellow, marginal, red, unsuitable. And it will come up with a list of those species. And it will also indicate what the limiting factors are for that tree. So at the top there, we've got a thing called dams. Well, that's actually the windiness of the site. So it may be that it's not a particularly stable site to grow trees, but you might be able to compensate from that by growing trees in a way that's, making sure that they are stable from the site, or looking at parts of the site and looking at microclimates rather than the whole site. Another tool which we can use is this climate matching tool. What this does, you put in your grid reference, and I've put the location of the university campus here in, and it tells you what locations in Europe and wider are experiencing weather that's predicted for this part of the world in 2071 to 2079. So potentially you could look and say, right, well actually we could get some trees of a provenance from southern England and we could move those up to this part of the world, and they may be better fitted towards a incoming climate. With all of this, you've got to be careful and spread the risks a little bit. You certainly wouldn't put many trees from 5 degrees from further south into the plantations, but it's an option again to spread risk. And when we choose a tree species, we want it to have a stress-free life, and we all want a stress-free life, so trees are not any different to the rest of us. But for trees, we can't do massage, yoga, spiritual retreats. We can't ease trees' pain in that way. So an important thing is to know your site, start off with, know what's there. So you can actually look to plant trees that are well suited, not only to the soils, but if you plant them in a mixture, they're well suited to each other. And then you get these cumulative impacts of stress. So, for instance, with ash dieback, there's a close correlation with honey fungus. So honey fungus could weaken the tree, ash dieback, it becomes more susceptible. And you get this right the way through with trees. It may be competition, it may be impact of stress from a damaging agent to the tree. So we've got grey squirrel damage there on field maple, or it may be something like the soy fly larva eating the leaves, so it's actually damaging the tree itself. Potentially not always a long-term damage, but it's bringing stress onto that tree at that point in time. Or it may be a competition for resources. There's a site there, someone decided to plant 36,000 trees per hectare in one little tiny bit. Well, that makes you 2,500 that you've talked about earlier look like parkland planting, and there's far too much competition there between the trees for light and for nutrient as they grow on. So we're looking at reducing stress for existing woodland. We could encourage mixed species and mixed age structure. We could actively manage woodlands so that they're not left to their own devices, and we can thin out trees, give them more access to light, nutrients. We could consider changes in felling and restocking, and also about tree species change or provenance change. We often think about the change of species, but we very rarely think about the change genetically. We need to be vigilant, monitoring regularly for issues, but also we need to keep up to date with what is an issue and know where to report it. Then we can deal with issues quickly. Crucially, we need to protect forest soils, but also soils around individual trees. So we need to protect from compaction and contamination. With carbon storage in soils, 2.8 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent are stored in forest soils, woodland soils, which is around 70% of the total carbon stock. So, yeah, we're storing carbon in trees, and then if that timber can be used for long use, buildings, that kind of thing, it's storing carbon for longer. But the soil is important. And I said about let's try and manage woodlands. Well, 58% of UK woodlands are not in active management. So that's a lot of woodlands that are potentially being neglected and could improve the condition by actually work being carried out. It may need to be sensitive work, and it always needs to be sensitive work when we're thinking about woodlands, but not doing any work is not the answer. But have we got enough resources to manage these woodlands in a traditional way going forward? How many horse loggers have we got? How much coppice do we need? How much charcoal do we need? So we maybe need to look at management on a slightly more industrial scale to bring some of these woodlands back into management. And that may require new machinery being looked at and adapted, and new markets being adapted for new products from timber. And we also need more contractors and foresters. There's a lot of forestry apprentices out there now. It's started 2 years ago and been a fantastic update in those. So we are getting more foresters, but we need more contractors and more people who can actually do work and undertake it in a sensitive and thoughtful way. So if we're creating new woodland, we need to reduce stress as well. And it's crucial that all planting's carried out to a high standard and that trees are handled and stored correctly. So the trees here were from a site near Newark where significant losses of bare root trees, and every single one of those trees there has got what we call a J root, because the planting slot's not been deep enough, the tree's been forced in and the roots are bent over, and that's compromising the tree short term and its ability to survive through the first few years, but also compromising it long term. So if we want trees that can stand there and become veterans, what they need is a decent root system to start with. There was a European study that 3/4 of all trees showed root deformation from poor planting technique. So the planting technique is crucial. We should consider autumn planting rather than winter and spring planting. The site that's got those trees on, the person's in there beating up at the moment with bare root trees. In my opinion, just far too late in the season and going to have a lot of losses. So we could consider autumn planting to allow root growth before frosts or drought in winter and spring. Could the planting be staggered to establish cover for trees before we plant more sensitive species? We could consider cell-grown trees, match the tree species to be planted to the site and to each other. I say that's crucial. Know the soils, and small trees with a good root system establish quicker than large trees. You see a lot of dead trees and poor looking trees on sort of roadside plantings when there's, really use larger trees. We should consider beyond local provenance, consider using natural colonisation. We need to be aware of what the climate is at the moment, but we also need to be looking forward to what it's going to be in the future. And competing vegetation control is crucial, particularly in drought scenarios. But we could consider using mulch to retain soil moisture. And also consider things like using mycorrhizal powders when planting, and ventilated shelters. On this site, for some reason, the owner decided to put spirals and canes and tree shelters on each tree. So it's doubling up on the protection. Unfortunately, it's going to bait the tree. So look at ventilated shelters. And the shelters question is not as straightforward as it used to be. We can't all have these bespoke bio shelters here that doubles up as a bush shelter, and that one's actually in Lincolnshire. But there's a tremendous variety now of bio shelters, but we don't necessarily know as much about them and the long-term stability of them and what the outcomes are going to be. So we've got sort of wool, pecan nut type ones here with mulch mats. The cardboard shelters there, I've trialled in the Woodland on our farm. 18 months is what we got from those. Even the more recent ones that have got a harder coating, we found that the snails stripped all the coating off. And those, and then you don't know what's in the snails, and then they all rot down. And then even on a site where you've gone sort of mulch mats and things, you've got biodegradable plastic pegs in the ground there, which were there from 20 years ago that site was planted. So how long are they going to last? So the important thing, I think, is to if you use your shelters, to actually collect them and take them away. But it's not a straightforward answer anymore. Collect them away for recycling. Hopefully, in the next few years, there'll be more information on trials that are being carried out and more solid information. So what other practical actions could we take? Well, we could look to diversify species composition. This should be considered for woodland, but it's not as people see it as a panacea, that simply by increasing more species we make a woodland more resilient. We seem to see that people throw a lot of trees at it, and the worst or the most severe case I had recently was 168 tree species on 2 hectares. Well, that's not woodland, and those trees are not going to be suited to that site, so we need to look beyond that. But we could also do changes in silvicultural situations, practices, and this is a continuous cover forestry or low impact silviculture. So it's actually moving woodland away from felling areas of trees large scale. It's maintaining woodland conditions in that woodland which suit the regeneration of the next generation of trees, but also suit a lot of the wildlife that's in there. It spreads the risk and also spreads the income flow throughout several years. So rather than just trees being felled and removed, there's a standard removal of trees when they reach a certain size, and they remove them from that site, depending on what the owner's objectives are and the nature of the trees themselves. Importantly, we all have a role to play with biosecurity. So whether we're visiting woodlands, we want to make sure that our boots are clean, if you're cycling or whatever, we've all got a role to play in this. Particularly the people that work in woodlands on a professional basis, we should be setting the standards. And keep eyes open if you're walking in the woodlands, and report things that might be ill-healthy trees through Tree Alert. Natural regeneration has a place to play. It can impart some level of natural selection. If you've got thousands of seedlings coming through, then there's going to be sort of survival of the fittest of competition to get through. But the success of natural regeneration, as we saw in the Woodland Trust report, is actually going down. We've got too many deer. You know, it can be limited by the vegetation that's present, by the depth of humus in the soil, lots of other things within there. Local provenance trees are not guaranteed to be well adapted to the climate presently. If they are local provenance that have gone through natural regeneration, then they're going to show, I'd say, that little bit more resilience because they've had to adapt to the site now. But also, what's local provenance? I remember spending time at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire, collecting acorns as part of the regulations there for growing on in nurseries, and the trees originally came from Germany 150 years ago. So, you know, we've got to think about that as well. So planting of trees allows the introduction of new species. It may allow us just to put the same species back, but a better genetic stamp for what we want to achieve in the woodland, if that's commercial. And allows us to put trees in from a more southerly seed source. And natural regeneration can be grant aided for woodland creation. Where we're dealing with these extremes now, and it is this real time of extremes, we need to think, well, can the infrastructure that we have in woodlands and forests cope with it? So, our culvert's going to get washed out, and then you're going to end up with flooding in local communities. A road's going to get washed out. You're then going to get sediment going into water reservoirs. If there's a wildfire, can you get in there? Can fire engines access it and get round? So we need to think of all these things. So the road network is an important consideration. And then you've got considerations here. So you've got a dam structure put in to stop sediment going into a watercourse when you're doing forest operations. So, think about those things. So where do we start? Well, my advice for a good starting place would be this document here, which was published in 2022 and can be downloaded for free. It identifies and selects adaptation measures for woodland management, and it will give you an idea about what a certain stance, what it could help against. So at the top we've got creating mixed species stands, could help for wind throw, wildfire, pests and diseases, drought, frost, no information on flooding. So it gives that kind of idea. And the documentation contains woodland management planning, which is really important, monitoring and assessing, which is even more important because we need to monitor the situation and assess, not just take what's right today as right for the next so many years, and links to case studies of adaptation. And it provides this framework. And as I've said, woodland management plans are crucial. If you're managing woodland, there should be a woodland management plan in place. You can create that plan, you can review it, you can identify risks, you can select measures, but then you can monitor and adjust as well. And it should be a live document. It should be one that changes throughout over the years, so you can actually go back, and it shouldn't be created and stuck in an office somewhere. No one actually look at it. And another good starting point is the UK Forestry Standard, and I'm not Mentimeter, so we'll go old school. Show of hands, how many people are aware of the UK Forestry Standard? So yeah, a few people, yeah. It's the government's approach to sustainable forestry, so it's extremely important. It's been updated recently, came into force October last year. And it gives these sort of statements of things that we should do. So woodland creation, we should enhance the potential of forests to help society and environment adapt to the various effects of climate change at the forest management plan review stage or earliest. So it's giving us all these things. We often hear about monocultures as well. Well, one of the things that changed in the last reiteration was that the total number of species that can be allocated percentage to a single species is reduced to 65% rather than 75%. So even the most commercial woodlands, be it a ex-mining plantation in Sherwood, has to have that diverse makeup within the forest management unit. And then it also says that you need to native broadleaf of trees, other tree species, open ground or ground managed for biodiversity is the primary objective. But as we've heard from some of the other speakers, it's also important that we plan to keep that open ground open. Otherwise, open ground in woodland soon becomes unopen ground. Further advice is available. There's lots of good leaflets and booklets across the hall there. Forest Research have got a lot of good information. They've got a thing called the Climate Change Hub, where information's put in there easily accessible. At their research station at Alice Holt, they've also got this adaptation trail where they've actually put some of the models into practice, and you can walk the site and actually see what that looks like. As I've said, soils are crucial, so you really get to know your soils. Royal Forestry Society have done quite a lot of information, and these forest development type sheets are quite important as well, and it's a framework and an easy follow guidance and a description of forest structures. So 7 different types, and it highlights all the information that you need to achieve that structure, and it's links to MVC types as well, and could be used for the creation of planning woodland. So it's actually giving someone an idea about what do they actually have to do to get to this point in a state when a woodland should be robust and resilient. So to wrap up, sometimes it's difficult to make changes without having all the information to hand, and the sad fact is we never will. We've got to make decisions with the best information we have to hand at the moment. And although it's difficult to do that, then we need to do that, because if we wait for all the information, it'll be too late to make any changes. And for a woodland to be healthy, it needs to have healthy trees in it that are thriving, not just surviving. So we need to look forward and take bold but informed steps to protect our woodlands into the next century beyond. And thank you for listening.